Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, your podcast guide to the history, heritage, buildings, culture and much more of the towns and cities of England. And today we have an episode full of surprises. Considered perhaps a gritty northern industrial city, but it's really quite different from the others. A city near the sea, but not a seaside town at all. A city slightly out on a limb, but yet a cultural centre. And a city perhaps unpretty in places, but with one of the finest old town districts in the land and a collection of museums the envy of anywhere. It's a fascinating, somewhat disarming place. We're visiting Kingston Upon Hull, or just Hull as it's usually known. And we really want to convince you to visit if you've not already been drawn to its cultural delights. But before that, I must introduce my co-host and itinerant historian, Daniel Gooch. Welcome back to the show, Daniel. How has your week been?
It's been good. My dad got married today. That's big news.
Wow.
I feel like I have a big life event every week, every time we do this.
Massive news. Congratulations to your dad.
He eloped to Gretna Green, would you believe?
The old-fashioned way.
A good way to do it. Don't tell anyone.
Wow. Well,
no, minimal fuss, minimal cost.
Congratulations all round. I've also had a wonderful week. I was at a wedding myself, actually, on the south coast. A really delightful wedding near Worthing. And Worthing is a fine place. A future episode, perhaps.
No, I've never been. I've never had cause to go. So yeah, whack it on the itinerary.
There's more there than you think. And you know what? This wedding was really funny. There were people from all over the world: Goa, New York, Dubai, Sydney, you name it. And I was just about to leave. I was making my goodbyes at the end, and encountered a couple I hadn't caught up with yet. And where were they from? Of course, Suffolk.
Really? Wow.
So we then spent 20 minutes talking about Ipswich Town Football Club, and I always have to pretend to be 20 years older than I actually am, because that's how you have to be.
Remember the good old days back when we were good?
So sometimes it's a big world, sometimes it's a small world. Well, look, we have lots to talk about in this episode, but before we do, I'd just like to thank everyone who's sent and said to me comments and suggestions so far on the podcast. It's really appreciated. We've had loads of requests, which we will work through with absolute pleasure. Please do check out our website, yeoldeguide.com, which has some show notes, links to all our episodes, and a league table containing all our scores for the places we visit. And as we've been doing this for about a year now, that league table is becoming substantial and interesting. So if you're new to the podcast, we score our city or town in 5 categories. That's all explained on the website. And the reason we do this really is to encourage us to take a variety of perspectives when visiting a city. There's more to Hull than fish and the house martins. So please leave any comments at yeoldeguide.com and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. But without further ado, Daniel, let's start with an overview of Hull.
Hull is a city of about 250,000 people, so it's definitely one of the largest places we've covered so far. It's actually the 4th largest city in Yorkshire by population, and it sits right on the huge Humber estuary, which forms the kind of the border between Yorkshire to the north and Lincolnshire to the south. It's quite an isolated city. Its rail links to London are few and slow, it's probably fair to say. There's no major main line that goes through the city, but it's at the confluence of many rivers into the Humber, which has historically given it quite a wide inland reach in the past, as well as its outward reach to trading ports across the North Sea. Now, the city's origins are actually quite unusual. There's no ancient Saxon or Roman or Neolithic settlement to speak of any significance here, because it was originally founded as a port in the 12th century for a nearby abbey, Moe Abbey, right at the point where the River Hull joins the Humber. It was founded possibly on the site of what's known as the Old Town, which we'll speak a lot more about later, but there is also a theory that it might actually have been founded elsewhere and only moved there to its current location in the mid-13th century when the River Hull changed its course. And it wasn't actually called Kingston Upon Hull at that point. It was called Wycon Hull. It only became Kingston Upon Hull, or Kingstown, in 1299 when King Edward I bought this little tiny hamlet of about 60 households as a military supply base for his Scottish campaigns and gave it a royal charter. Now, the port was really important to Hull. It continued to grow in importance and is what many people, certainly industrially, will know Hull for. And by the 20th century, it had become the third largest in England by trading volume. But the town of Hull also grew fairly quickly by the standards of the time. It had a population of about 3,500 by the late 14th century. But this did begin to decline a bit because the wool trade, in which the town specialised, lost ground to the finished cloth trade based elsewhere, and some architectural evidence shows that this actually led to a bit of a kind of diminishment in building works in the town. But nonetheless, it did remain militarily important, and Henry VIII built a new castle there in 1542, which lasted until the 19th century, until it was demolished, which was there to defend against possible French attack, and it later held crucial arms supplies during the Civil War. Economically, the town rallied and became pretty stable and prosperous as a major port town by the mid-18th century. Its population grew to about 13,000 by 1760 because the town acted as a trading port for much of Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire and down to Lincolnshire. And the city grew from its centre in the Old Town to the east and to the west from the 18th century and underwent quite a lot of improvements, with brand new civic buildings, probably reaching its zenith by Edwardian times, shortly after it became a city in 1897. But decline did follow, again, as the fishing industry, on which the town relied heavily, started to suffer. And after suffering huge damage during the Blitz in the Second World War, the city was mostly rebuilt from the 50s onwards, but it continues to be a centre of shipping for both passengers and freight, and later became the UK's second quadrennial city of culture in 2017. So lots and lots to talk about in this city as we go through this podcast.
And it feels like it's going through a process of renaissance as we speak. So what's really interesting about Hull, for me, I mean, it's not like some of the ancient cities we've visited. We visited Chester, we visited Bath, Colchester, where we've spoken about Roman, we've spoken about Saxon. It's more modern in that sense, but it's older than I expected. I had Hull in the same bracket as Sheffield or Leeds, as a place of Birmingham that really expanded massively in the 19th century. But there was a lot there beforehand. So it's a bit of both.
Yep, and there's definitely a kind of a contrast in urban landscape and architectural styles. Not wishing to give too much of a spoiler for later on, but it definitely has kind of the old feel and the more modern feel from the late 20th century.
Let's go on to our first category, politics and war. And Daniel, you mentioned the origins of the name, Kingston upon Hull. So that seems like a good place to start. Let's start with the king and his purchase that you mentioned in 1299.
Yep, absolutely. I think this is a really interesting story. As we heard earlier, Edward I, he bought the port from the local abbey, which founded the first settlement in Hull. I'm not sure how much say the abbey had in the matter. Written records do say they were, to quote, well content with the purchase, but let's be honest, it could have been an offer they couldn't refuse. But Edward bought the port to act as a supply base during his wars with Scotland. He had acquired two other ports in the northeast, but they were either too inland or too exposed for his purposes. And then the larger trading port, for which Hull became famous, developed from this. So you could say, in a sense, that Hull owes its existence to its military importance. And moving on to later battles, if we can do that, the Civil War is probably an important thing to talk about, because Hull played quite an important part in the early stages of the Civil War, because it held a very large arms supply. Some sources say the largest in the country outside London, so was really very important to control. There was an early siege here in 1642. The Hull Corporation declared its allegiance to Parliament, so the king besieged the town in August of that year. But Hull was a very difficult town to attack. It was protected by fortifications, both natural ones with the River Hull and Humber around it, and man-made fortifications. And it was also very easy to provision during a siege. because it had these deep water links to other places. So the Royalists really had their work cut out in this siege. The king did try to enter the town during this time, but was denied access at the Beverley Gate, down at the west end of today's Whitefriar Gate. And this was one of the gates that went through the city's walls. And you can still see the remnants of the Beverley Gate today in the town. And he was later defeated in battle by the town's defenders. The Royalist forces besieged the town again in 1643. They're clearly gluttons for punishment, but defeated again in October in battle. And this actually left Hull the only major town in Yorkshire under parliamentary control at that point. So it did have a slightly unique status in that respect.
So you mentioned the Beverley Gate. Is there anything else that we can see from this era?
From these battles, I don't
There's not
think
much
so,
left,
no.
is there? But I don't feel there's much left of the fortifications. I mean, aside from the Beverley Gate, there's no real remnants.
I think the fortifications were all demolished later on. I think the town walls were demolished to build part of the docks that surround the old town these days.
Yeah. And shall we discuss the pilgrimage of grace before we go on to the politicians?
Yeah, we'll go back in time a bit to the pilgrimage of grace when Hull, another time, it was besieged, and this time successfully. The pilgrimage of grace, to give some context, was a 1536 rebellion which began in Yorkshire primarily against Henry VIII's religious reforms, including the famous dissolution of the monasteries and break from the Roman Catholic Church. But there were numerous other factors, such as an economic crisis caused by a poor harvest, and also kind of the general loss of support on a charitable and community level from the monasteries. This all came into it as well. Hull was besieged, and as well as the siege itself, Hull was also where Robert Constable, one of the leading rebels, was executed. So despite this early success, ultimately it wasn't a happy location for the Pilgrimage of Grace.
A sad ending. So I think it's worth now. So I think it's now worth going on to probably the most famous son of Hull, I think it's fair to say, William Wilberforce.
Yep, I think that's reasonable. William Wilberforce, the famous abolitionist, had very deep connections with Hull. He was the biggest abolitionist voice against the slave trade in Parliament in the early 19th century. His voice contributed to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 very famously, and in most respects, slavery itself starting in a process from 1833. And what's less well known is he was also a founding member of the RSPCA. And he was a true son of Hull. He was born in the town. He was educated there. He was MP for Hull from 1780 to 1784. And these days you can visit his birthplace in Hull, Wilberforce House. It's a museum telling the story of his life as well as the slave trade and West African culture. And it's in a very convenient location in the museum's quarter of the Old Town, which is an area we'll definitely be coming back to later on. Now, we do like to give a bit of balance in the Oldie Guide, and Wilberforce generally has a very positive reputation today, which we don't need to dig into detail because it's so well known. But it's also fair to say some have criticised that he was focused only on injustices abroad and didn't have much regard for the plight of the poor in the UK. The criticism not just that he was ignorant or impassive about this, but he actually supported laws which hindered the poor. For example, his support for the Corn Laws, which imposed tariffs on bread and kept bread prices high, and his support for laws that limited free protest and assembly. So there is a view that Wilberforce maybe wasn't as radical in his commitment to liberty and equality as his reputation suggests. Some say he had a kind of a paternalistic view of the difference between rich and poor and the place of women rather than an egalitarian desire to eliminate the difference. I think it's hard for us to take a position on this without making some kind of distasteful competition or what about competition between the abject poverty suffered by the poor in industrialised Britain and this odious crime of the slave trade committed overseas. There's the danger also of trying to apply our own modern sensibilities and psyche to something from the past. All we can really do here is kind of acknowledge both parts of his life and work and say that these are presented in Wilberforce House.
I think that's fair. I think we can take a balanced view on Wilberforce on Ye Olde Guide. I mean, my main beef with him, obviously Wilberforce is a incredible historical figure in Britain, but I suppose my only beef is he sort of seems to take the limelight off other influential figures in the abolitionist movement. Granville Sharp, James Ramsay, Thomas Clarkson get overlooked, and those are just the white guys. People of colour and women get very little mention. But for Hull, he's an enormous character, and he gives us a reason to visit because he's given us the Wilberforce Museum. You've mentioned we've got a Doric column erected in tribute to him, located on Wilberforce Drive. I think it was moved at some point. And adjacent to the museum that you've mentioned is the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. You'll remember there was a wall next to it. I think it's called the Humanitarian Wall, which displays the names of all those who have fought for freedom throughout history, throughout the world. Big names like Steve Biko, Olaudah Equiano, Nelson Mandela, and Toussaint Louverture, as well as William Wilberforce. So that's given us another aspect in visiting Hull, similar to what we saw in Lancaster, I suppose. Something to reflect on.
Yep, absolutely.
And I suppose that, on the subject of Hull's MPs, another MP for Hull was Thomas Ferrens. He was Hull's MP 1906 to 1918. And he was known for making recurrent speeches for women's rights. And we'll come back to Ferrens because he's left legacy on Hull through Reckitt and Sons, which we'll speak about in industry, and philanthropy, which gave the Ferrens Art Gallery, amongst other things. And his name is immortalised in the Ferrens Way Road, which I'm sure we'll have an interesting discussion on. And there's one more very well-known MP associated with Hull.
You have John Prescott in mind, I assume.
I do.
Former Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. He's actually Welsh, but we still like to mention people with close connections to the towns we visit. And
he punched a guy in Wales as well, didn't he?
Is that where he did it?
He did it in Rhyl.
Oh, Rhyl, okay.
2 Jags. I think he was egged.
Yes, that was it. Literally egged, not just egged on, literally egged, as I recall.
But nevertheless, a big figure in Hull, and he's known as
Baron Prescott of Kingston Upon Hull. He was MP for the city for 40 years, I think, and a director of one of the local rugby league clubs, Hull Kingston Rovers, who we went to see.
An impressive figure, and it's good to have good to mention a politician that's still alive on the podcast. So, John, if you're listening, do get in touch.
We'll treat John Prescott, see if we can get him to listen to it.
Is there anyone else you want to mention in politics and war, or should we sum up?
No, I'm happy to sum up. So yeah, there's definitely some variety here, and it's excellent that Wilberforce's story and the history of slavery are commemorated in his own house, his own birthplace. That's probably kind of back to one of the points you were mentioning earlier. It was probably about as far as the tangible remnants go for this category. As you mentioned, no fortifications or other military remnants really are remaining. The castle's gone, the walls have gone, the gates have all but gone, just a few tiny bits of the Beverley Gate are visible in the ground. I suppose, plus, we can't really say that any of the battles fought here have been particularly significant in the long run. So my score is going to be good, but not spectacular. It's going to be a 4 for me.
I think that's right. I think there's some tangible history there, and for me, there's the city proved to be a lot older than I expected, and I enjoyed the story of the king making the purchase. But also, I think we've got 4 MPs I rather like there. 4 if you include Neil Coyle, who went to university there. So that gives us a series of politicians and a fantastic museum. For me, I'm going to go slightly higher than you. I'm going to give it a 5.
5, so 9 out of 20 in total on politics and war.
In our second category, we look at the legacy of scientific and industrial innovation of a city. And Hull is really interesting for me, as I mentioned before. Before researching this podcast, I had Hull as this big modern industrial city, Sheffield or a Leeds or a Birmingham, but it's got a much older and more diverse industrial heritage. So where should we start? Should we start with the docks?
As you said, that there is quite a lot we could cover here overall, because Hull has had this diverse economy throughout its history, but certainly the port has been the centrepiece, both economically and really physically, of the town for centuries. To give an overview of the port's history, it grew away from being that simple initial military supply base and began trading wool, lead and grain from northeast England in the Middle Ages, and started importing raw materials from locations around the Baltic, particularly timber and oilseed. Trade did decline later in Tudor and Stuart times, But increasing industrialisation in the region around Hull gave it this opportunity to rebound later. Proper docks were constructed along the route of the old town walls due to increased river traffic from the 1770s up till the 1820s, which really brought it into kind of the industrial age. And what's very notable about Hull's trade, really up to industrial times, is just how well connected it was internationally with regions around the Baltic Sea, even more than really with English locations for the coasting trade for internal river trade or around the coast of England. During the first half of the 18th century, over half of overseas ships arriving at Hull came from Scandinavia. And there's one source that even notes that before the railways, it was actually easier to get from Hull to Hamburg than it was to get to Leicester or Manchester. So you can easily see how Hull developed this outward-looking international economy from its location on the northeast coast. And Hull shipping links were later extended further around the British Empire, really following the emergence of steam power, with actually in the 1960s, 10% of the country's foreign trade came through Hull. And this changed later a bit due to developments in international trade, particularly the introduction of air travel, which consolidated international trade into other areas. And the old docks were closed after the 60s, but the new Queen Elizabeth dock opened in 1969 for container traffic, at the point where new opportunities for international trade grew with Britain's entry into the common market and the new development of the technique of containerisation.
I was going to say, I'm glad you mentioned steam, because Hull had a disproportionate level of steam-propelled shipping because it was shorter trade routes. It was Northern Europe, it was Russia, which lended itself. So Hull became a centre of steam shipping ahead of its rival ports, your Liverpools. Another element of its docks history that I picked up, the history of the railways and the docks in Hull, and that the railway companies dictated the growth of Hull's docks and docks across the country, and which docks got railways and how the expansions of docks were funded. And Hull was competing on two levels. It was competing nationally with Liverpool or Newcastle and London, but it was also competing locally on the Humber with Grimsby, Immingham, and the city's leaders were engrossed in how to fund the expansion of its docks.
Well, I think it's incredible as a general point just how much the railways owned. I think when British Rail nationalised the railways, they didn't just get track and trains. They got a huge plethora of land, industrial works, docks, hotels, boats.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing array of assets they had. And yeah, I think the railway companies owned the docks initially in Hull, so you could certainly see that development here.
And it's still one of the biggest ports today, you're saying, because of that new, did you say the Queen Elizabeth dock?
Queen Elizabeth dock, yeah. It's given opportunities for passenger traffic and container traffic to this day. But it's more than just an economic resource, of course. It's what's interesting about the port in Hull is how it really fundamentally shaped the character of the town. For the wealthy inhabitants, the town's merchants became rich. Some even became high-ranking aristocrats. But even for the less wealthy, Hull gave the town its character. There's a writer called George Head who wrote a brilliant account of work at Hull Docks in 1835. He covers the journey over the Humber, the pretty gruesome team process of whaling, what you do with a whale once you get it back to the docks, other manufacturing activities. And what I found fascinating, how men used a diving bell to dive underwater for up to 2 hours at a time, as well as he was covering the social lives and customs of the workers there. It's just a shame I haven't got time to read through it all now. I'd double the length of the podcast, but I'll stick a link up on Twitter. It's a great resource. But what it brings out really is that Hull was a true port town. It was a town based on its port. It wasn't just a town that simply had a port. It wasn't just an economic resource. It was fundamental to the character of the town.
And there's so many anecdotes. There's one about the bus companies putting special buses with wooden slats instead of upholstered seats, so the stinky workers didn't destroy the bus upholstery. And then after 7 p.m, they'd have nice upholstered buses again.
That sounds like what the rail companies used to do with football specials. Stick the old stock on because they know what could happen to it.
You're going to get covered in beer.
Yeah.
All right, so should we talk about some of the other industries that did grow up?
I think fishing is the natural link, because as well as its port, Hull is also famous for the fishing industry that grew up around the port. This started as a whaling industry in the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1800, 40% of the country's whalers were based in Hull.
Wow.
And whaling essentially kind of died out because of overfishing, but more conventional forms of fishing became especially important in Hull from about 1850 and became more intensive later due to the introduction of new trawling techniques and what you were talking about earlier, steam power. It didn't just help with trade, it helped with fishing techniques as well. And this all allowed fishing far out from the coast, while the emerging railways increased the ability to supply the increasing market demand from the growing northern industrial cities for the fish that Hull supplied. The industry did decline due to overfishing after World War I, the same story of overfishing, and it completely collapsed after the cod wars of the 1970s. But it is celebrated today in Hull's famous aquarium, the Deep, and in the fish trail. But most of all, I should say what the fish trail is, kind of a trail around Hull of different kind of engravings of fish which take you around all the different interesting parts of the old town. But most of all, it's celebrated in the Maritime Museum, which originally opened as the Museum of Fisheries and Shipping in 1912. It covers the fishing industry, whaling, maritime trades, and also you can visit the old trawling ship, the Arctic Corsair. So much celebration of the fishing industry in Hull.
No, there really is, and I think we can highly recommend all of those things. I think they're the Deep, the Maritime Museum, and the Fish Trail, all very much worth doing. Now, I mentioned in the politics category Thomas Ferrens, and that really brings us on to the company that he worked for Reckitt and Son. Eventually,
Reckitt Benckiser. So today, one major brand that has a presence in Hull is Reckitt Benckiser. But I think we probably need to give some context to overall the state of industry in Hull, because given that Hull's port was up until not that long ago one of the largest in the country in trading volume, you might naturally expect lots of heavy industry to have grown up around it, like it did in Newcastle, in London, or around the Clyde in Glasgow. But notwithstanding the fishing trade, Hull's port was almost exclusively a trading area. Not that much heavy industrial hinterland grew up around it. What industry there was really grew up based on the imports from the port. You had corn milling and seed crushing. This is all about processing raw materials that came into Hull through the port. And one of the major brands that developed from that and still has its presence is, as you said, Reckitt Benckiser. And this is the organisation responsible for probably half the products in your kitchen and bathroom. It's not necessarily a famous brand in itself, but it has these brands: Airwick, Dettol, Durex, Vanish, Nurofen, Harpic, Lemsip, lots and lots more things that we'll all have. And the Reckitt half of the merger started from a starch mill in Hull, operated by the original Mr. Reckitt, Isaac Reckitt. And I think Thomas Ferrens was an early partner in the business as well.
And that's a massive firm now, no longer HQ in Hull, but still nevertheless a major employer. And as you say, household brands. I was really interested in that. You'd made that comment about the type of industry that's sort of grown up in Hull, and it's sort of, I suppose, because it's so far away from the resources that would have led to the boom in industries in the 18th and 19th centuries in other cities. It's far away from coal, it's far away from limestone and fast-flowing water. So it didn't have that industry, but as you say, it sort of ended up with these industries that naturally spring off the port.
You see a similar thing in many kind of small towns around the country in brewing and malting. This is the obvious thing. You see the conversion of raw agricultural products from the agricultural hinterland into products for sale onwards to in other places. It's something that happened a lot.
We sort of wanted to reflect on, the current day. It's a city of relatively high unemployment. The GDP per capita now is quite low. It's one of the lowest cities in the country, poor by many measures. But there have been some new manufacturing opportunities arising.
Yeah, one of the main ones is the Siemens wind turbine factory, which opened in 2016. So there could be a bright future for the town. If you're talking about modern day industry, I don't think we'd be forgiven if we didn't mention Hull's phone boxes.
Oh, of course.
One of the most notable things about the town, which, unlike the traditional red used in the rest of the country, are all painted a creamy white. Now, the reason for this is based on the organisation of telecommunications in Hull. Unlike the rest of the phone network in Britain, the phone network in Hull has always been independent of the national network. So nationally, the phone network was operated by the Post Office and later British Telecom, the Post Office giving its red colour to phone boxes. But in Hull, it was run by the local authority from 1903 up to 2007. It's been privatised and sold off since then, but it still remains independent from the national network in its control. So yeah, Post Office red used elsewhere. Hull's alone stayed cream. It also means you don't see any crown marks on Hull's phone boxes because they weren't a national, i.e. a crown service.
So it really is unique, and I think they had, because the Yellow Pages doesn't exist anymore, I suppose, but they had their own version of the Yellow Pages, didn't they? Like, I assume cream pages.
I suppose it would make sense. We didn't get red pages. That'd be hard to read.
So that really is a unique element of Hull, and you see that when you're in the city. It takes you by surprise. What's wrong with that phone box? And I suppose, sort of putting my old engineering hat back on, I couldn't go to Hull and not mention the enormous Humber Bridge, which you can walk across on foot if you so wish. It's somewhat outside of the city, but it's nearby, and it's 2.22 kilometres long. But at the time of its opening in 1981 and until 1998, it was the longest bridge span in the world. And that span is so large that the top of its two concrete columns are 36 millimetres further apart at the top compared with what they are at the bottom. And this is to account for the curvature of the earth.
Wow. I have to ask you, because I'm not an engineer, unlike you. When you say the span of the bridge, does that refer to the total length, or is it just the distance between the two columns?
The record breaking is the distance between the two columns.
Right. Okay.
So you might have had longer bridges, and I think you probably think of many which covered a longer body of water, but they would have had pylons or structures in between. So this was the longest span, and I think it's still up there. I think it might still be around 15th. Despite all the enormous bridges that are being built, so it's very, very impressive.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's probably time to do scores now.
Yes, there was. And you know what? There's an awful lot there. And a lot of interesting anecdotes. Whether it's the bridge we've just done, whether it's Reckitt and Son, all those products, whether it's the KCOM phone boxes. I think there's quite a bit there. And as I say, when we were talking about the history of the docks, we barely touched on some of the fascinating industrial disputes and investment disputes. There's a whole podcast in itself. We might have to go away and make an off-piste episode all about it because it's so interesting. So, I think there's just such a large legacy of it that's there to see. I'm giving it an 8.
Ooh, that's probably the highest we've had in science industry for a long time. That's very good.
That's a generous score.
Well, Hull gets a good score for me too. It's not so much for the history of the industry, though some of the statistics and its trading links are hugely impressive, but more for how it's celebrated, particularly the fishing industry. The Maritime Museum is excellent, but I can't wait to go when it's refurbished because some of the renderings of the post-refurbishment museum look fantastic. The fish trail, which I mentioned earlier, is really quite fun and gets you a good walk around the old town of Hull. And while it's only indirectly linked to the fishing trade, the Deep Aquarium is such a major landmark. I'm quite happy to give Hull the credit for that. So it's good for me. It's not quite as high, but it's going to be a 7 from me.
Our third category is arts and culture. I don't know about you, Daniel, but I feel in recent years, Hull has become a real cultural centre of the country.
About the one thing people say to you when you're going to Hull is, oh, that was the City of Culture, wasn't it? And yes, indeed it was. UK City of Culture in 2017, the second one after, I think, Londonderry first of all. And I think this sticks in the mind because people don't really expect this designation to be given to somewhere like Hull. But we probably need to point out what the City of Culture actually is. It's not an award for the most cultural place. It's a status bid for and awarded by a government department, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which is more designed to kind of engender and create cultural events and regeneration. In fact, the chair of the awarding panel said that Hull won because its pitch was revolved around a city, to quote him, coming out of the shadows, which kind of gives you a sense of what the award is for, and really almost sounds like damnation with faint praise. But, nonetheless, we can still look at Hull's cultural legacy because there are lots of points celebrated as part of that City of Culture year. The first thing to talk about is Hull's music scene. And Liam, I know you're a big fan of the House Martins and the Beautiful South, so I'm going to let you talk about them.
I suppose Hull in the 1980s became quite a diverse centre of music, and this may have come about because of that decline, the industrial decline that we spoke about. That tends to give rise to musical scenes. We saw it a bit in Coventry. In the 1970s, 1980s, the city had a thriving pub open mic scene, and that's the sort of thing that the House Martins started with. It started with Paul Heaton and Stan Cullimore playing in pubs, and indeed we went up to the Grafton. You remember where they used to play, and that their music is celebrated in the pub. Paul Heaton wasn't from Hull. He moved there. There's a quote of his, something like Trotsky wanted to move to the seaside. A sort of a cynical and political language in that description, which sort of sums up the sort of the lyrical content of the House Martins and particularly Beautiful South. The House Martins themselves were discovered by John Peel, as things often were back then, and probably their best known song is Happy Hour. They didn't last very long. They basically imploded in 1988, but Beautiful South came out of the ashes, and that was two of its members, Paul Heaton and Dave Hemingway. Beautiful South, which are known for, massive hits, particularly in the 90s, songs such as Rotterdam or Anywhere, Don't Marry Her, which had a rude word in it, which all the kids laughed at school, Song for Whoever, and my favourite, Perfect 10. And Another House Martin was Norman Cook, who later became Fatboy Slim. We've got other musicians from Hull I think we have to mention. I know you've got a particular favourite. I'll just mention a couple more first. Mick Ronson, who was guitarist for Spiders from Mars, and he apparently had to be persuaded to play with David Bowie in 1970. I gather he was drawing lines for a rugby pitch on a park in Hull, and he had to be persuaded to play with Bowie, which is quite extraordinary. But I suppose at 1970, was that before David Bowie was David Bowie? He might have still had his original name, Davy Jones, so I'm not sure. That may have influenced his decision. Spiders from Mars are celebrated at Hull's Paragon Railway Station. It's one of the first things you see if you arrive by train in Hull. Other artists that you'll recognise from Hull, Everything But the Girl. They're a duet and had some big hits, including Missing. Acrylics, spelt in a weird way, were a ska band from Hull, and that's another connection we've got with Coventry here. They played with some of the Coventry ska bands that we mentioned in our first ever episode, and their saxophonist Roland Gift went on to be the frontman of Fine Young Cannibals. Search for She Drives Me Crazy and you'll recognise it. And you're a big fan of one of the bands from Hull as well, aren't you, Daniel?
I don't know if I'd say that. Talk about the Beautiful South. Actually, you mentioned the rude word in Perfect 10. I have to confess, until we went to Hull and I listened to it when we got home, I'd never heard the original version. I'd only ever heard the radio edit. I put it on
rude word is in Don't Marry Her.
Sorry, yes, Don't Marry Her. That's it. So I put it on in the kitchen and thought, what's this about? Wasn't expecting that. Yeah, we did go up to the Grafton. My friend whose grandmother's from Hull, who spent a lot of time there in his childhood, described that as posh Hull.
Well, it was quite nice.
Yeah. It was nice. It was a nice area, certainly.
Nice restaurants and places for a drink. So we would encourage listeners visiting to get out of a city centre when you visit.
Absolutely. And I have to say, your karaoke rendition of Perfect 10 was excellent. If we get 10,000, I don't know, positive reviews on somewhere, then I'll post the video one day.
Thank you. I didn't know that video existed.
I'll send it to you first.
Please delete.
So yeah, band. I don't know if I would describe myself as a fan, but a pretty notable band is the early industrial group Throbbing Gristle, who were formed in Hull in the 1970s. Now, as I mentioned, they're an industrial group, but if your idea of industrial music is more the kind of industrial rock or industrial metal of, say, Nine Inch Nails or some of Marilyn Manson's work, you'll find Throbbing Gristle a very different and much more challenging listen. And I have to admit, they are a band I've probably tried a dozen times to get into, but they're just a little bit too avant-garde for my tastes. And they actually satirise that point themselves. The subtitle of one of their albums is A Beginner's Guide to the Music of Throbbing Gristle, which it very much isn't. So you can give them full marks for self-awareness.
I think that's a very good assessment. So there's probably enough on music. There's a hell of a lot there. I mean, there's a lot of variety. I think that's going to lead to a pretty good score. I may have to go away and make a whole playlist, including Throbbing Gristle. But that's enough music. I said there were going to be more connections with Coventry. So here's the second one. The Poet Laureate Phillip Larkin.
Yeah, who we did cover Larkin in the Coventry episode in quite a lot of detail, so we won't dwell too much on his works here. But he did have strong connections with Hull, which you can talk about. He was the librarian at the University of Hull for 30 years until he died in 1985, and made a very rare film appearance in a 1964 TV programme showing John Betjeman around the city. And he's been celebrated in modern times. There's a statue of him at the station. And there was the Larkin Festival in 2010 on the 25th anniversary of his death. But another poet I'd like to talk about, that's okay, is Andrew Marvell. Because he's a 17th century metaphysical poet and satirist who was born and educated in Hull, later became MP for the town during the interregnum, between the reigns of Charles I and Charles II, when we were a republic, and after the restoration of the monarchy. Now, he was, as I said, kind of a metaphysical poet in the vein of maybe the more famous John Donne. His form of poetry, his era, was kind of based on an analysis of human feelings rather than the representation of the physical and the tangible. That's what we come to mean by kind of metaphysical poetry of this era. His most well-known poems are probably The Garden, To His Coy Mistress, and Upon Appleton House. To His Coy Mistress is possibly the best known, and in this poem, Marvell tries basically to persuade his lover there's too little time in life for coyness and they should just get on with it and have sex, to put it bluntly. Carpe diem, essentially. And he does mention the Humber in the poem. It's actually a really lovely poem. I recommend it if you've not read it, Liam.
Oh, I'll try. I mean,
give it a go.
Poetry's not my thing.
No, not mine either, but I like.
Maybe I'll grow into it. I'm glad you said. I'm glad you explained what metaphysical poetry was. Maybe my New Year's resolution next year will be to read some poems, and I'll start with Andrew Marvell. How about that?
Start there, then move to John Donne. Today in Hull, there's a bit of a legacy. There's a school named after Andrew Marvell, and there was a whaling ship built in the town, I think, in the 19th century, named after him. So not a huge legacy, but there's something there.
Fantastic. And is there anyone else you want to mention in arts and culture?
Quick run through other notable Hullensians. I think that's the demonym. Ebenezer Cobb Morley. I don't know if that's a name you'll know, but he is hugely important and very famous in the history of football. He is really one of the kind of the fathers of modern football. He played a crucial role in the founding of the FA and in codifying football's rules. He was born in Hull. He lived there till he was 22 years old. He had a Google Doodle in 2018, actually. And right in the centre of Hull, there is a pub named after him. Also, we can talk about Rhys Shearsmith, one of the League of Gentlemen. He's from Hull. He actually went to Andrew Marvell's school. And finally, a fictional link. Robinson Crusoe, star of the eponymous novel, was from Hull. And there's a plaque in Queen's Gardens which shows him marooned on his island. And actually, in the opening of the book, Robinson Crusoe states that his father was from Bremen and settled in Hull. So we're coming back kind of round in a nice neat circle to those Baltic trading links that Hull had as a cultural reference point as well as an economic one. Surprised
that you managed to go the whole category without mentioning rugby league, especially since we had such a lovely day out.
Well, Hull Kingston Rovers, that was excellent. The ground's a bit far out. You have to get a bus there, but it's well worth it when you're there. I think I've been there. I think that was my fourth visit, actually.
I had a great time. So that's brilliant. Should we sum up?
It's all interesting stuff. And what I like is that Hull does seem to kind of infuse the works of Marvell, Larkin to some extent, and the character of Robinson Crusoe. But we have our old question of what lasting, tangible legacy has Hull left to the world of art and culture? And the answer is probably limited to whatever role it played in the specific output of these particular artists, but not a great deal more. I know we said E.C. Morley was one of the founders of football, but I haven't found any evidence that being from Hull was a major influence on that. And more broadly, there hasn't been a huge unified cultural movement that's come from the town, notwithstanding the array of musicians that have come from there. So again, the score is reasonable but limited, so I'm going to give it a 3.5. I was tempted to give it an extra mark for serving me the cheapest pint I've had in a long time, but I thought that would just be favouritism.
One thing that really struck me on our visit to Hull is the mark that's been left by the Capital of Culture process and all the events that occurred during that. There's a sort of a legacy of works of art dotted around the town. I remember when we were in the food hall, the covered market, there was a artwork in there. There were various bits of art dotted around the city, and also it left its mark in the stories that people told. We spoke to various people around the city, and they often mentioned events during the City of Culture, and I remember some of those at the time, and someone did get out of Hull. I remember the artwork where lots of people painted themselves blue and walked around naked, thousands of people blue filling the streets. It's a really memorable piece of art. So I'm going to go slightly higher than you. I'm going to give it a 5. Our fourth category is about the urban heritage of Hull. And Hull really is a city of multiple urban expansions, each of which is of a very different character. So let's explore, first of all, those phases of development before diving into some of the best bits you can see today.
I think there's actually quite an interesting story to be told just looking at the history of Hull's development and urban expansion over the centuries. If we go back to those proper origins of the town under its charter from Edward I, this Hull was laid out as a Norman new town in a grid pattern, which is quite typical of Norman new towns. And there's some legacy of that left today in the layout of the old town in Hull. Yeah. So Hull's origins, really, as well as its kind of expanded present post-war rebuilt form, did lay in these boom periods for unified planned forms of urban development, just on a smaller scale. There wasn't much immediate structural development to the town. Edward did fortify it, but unfortunately, as we've said, none of the 1.5 miles of fortifications remains today. They were all knocked down or fell down by the 19th century. The medieval town walls were demolished to make room for the new docks. And it's a pity because they were possibly the largest medieval brick building in the country. It used millions of bricks, and there is only that small fragment that remains today. The next important era in Hull's expansion is probably the Georgian era, when the city underwent major improvements, as did much of urban England. It's a common theme in Ye Olde Guide. Arthur Young, a travel writer from the 1790s, gives us some impression of how much Hull had changed. He said in 1797, "In the 30 years since I was at Hull, I conceive there are few places in the kingdom more improved than this. A new town is added, containing many very handsome, well-built houses. The streets are wide and the houses elegant." And then later, from the 19th century, Hull began to grow away from this old town central area. Because of its high population growth, it expanded to the east and to the west early on, and then underwent substantial suburban expansion later in the 1930s. And this era of Hull's urban life is shown brilliantly in the Hull Street Life Museum. Now, I don't know what you thought about this, Liam, but I was really impressed by this museum. It had full-scale mock-ups, not just of the 1940s Hull Street, but representations of many other parts of Hull's historical urban life. It had transport, but also leisure time, such as arcades and a small cinema. And it would be definitely right near the top of my recommendations of things to do in Hull.
Oh, 100%. It was absolutely superb. Incredible collections of transport as well. If you think about it, well, it had trams, it had a huge collection of bikes, a huge collection of cars. And
it was excellent. And a small mock-up of a station platform, I think, as well, with a steam engine there. We have to move on, though, to probably the most infamous part of Hull's urban development, the post-World War II rebuild. Something we talk about a lot on Ye Olde Guide in various places. But we have to put the context on this, which is the huge damage suffered by Hull in the Blitz. Really, it was second only to London in the damage it suffered in this country. Around 95% of its buildings were damaged or destroyed. And really, this was because of Hull's proximity to the Humber, which was used by the Luftwaffe for pilots for navigation. And its commercial buildings especially were particularly badly damaged. After the war, there was a loosening of relaxation of commercial planning, regulation and taxation. And this really, along with an increase in the supply of building resources, meant that a plan was drawn up to rebuild Hull's commercial centre. Now, unfortunately, this didn't go entirely as people might have liked. As anyone walking around Hull today will know, it has led to some, let's be honest, horribly ugly buildings skirting around the remaining old town. And possibly even worse, with the closure of the old docks and the establishment of the container port and the construction of the A63 road carving up the old town, Hull still has maritime trade, but this has been kind of physically cut off by the road, by the docks moving out, and become separate from the city. So Hull, in effect, has kind of ceased to be this port town, a town characterised by its port, and become simply a town with the docks.
That's right.
To be fair to it, modern times have given us some more positive developments. There's the lovely building housing the Deep. There's a nice repackaging of the old docks particularly along Prince's Dock Street as a commercial dining and bar area. So there is a lot of bad, but also a lot of good there, particularly the old town, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute. But Liam, I wondered if you had any reflections on the post-World War II rebuild. I know it's an area of history you're particularly interested in.
Arguably, it's got a lot in common with Coventry, and I think after the Blitz, cities like Coventry and Plymouth and Hull, which had suffered the most bombing, they were earmarked for whole-scale rebuilding. But actually, like Coventry, if we wind back to episode 1, what we learnt when we visited Coventry was actually some of that whole-scale development started before the Blitz. It was already happening. And you know, when you show up at Hull Paragon Station, you get out, you come across this big and I think unpleasant road. That's my opinion. Ferrens Way, named after Thomas Ferrens. That was conceived as a grand sort of neo-Georgian wide thoroughfare that was meant to be the sort of the jewel in the crown. It certainly hasn't happened, but that was carved through a slum before the war. And in fact, most of the housing in Hull was built in the 1930s. The huge expansive estates that are built on the flat land around Hull. Much of that was the 30s, and then there was another wave post-war as well. But I suppose that post-war planning that you've talked about, you've spoken about that grand plan. I think that was a Patrick Abercrombie job, and he famously had a plan for London and Plymouth, and Edwin Lutyens, who did New Delhi, which is utterly extraordinary. They had a grand plan for Hull, and it never really happened, as you say, and partly that's because of the land ownership. I suspect there are a whole bunch of reasons, and you're left with very little. There are the odd gems in there. I think there's Festival House that's quite impressive. There's the Co-op building. I don't think it's a Co-op anymore, but that's the one with the big mural on the front, the Three Ships mural, 4,000 panels, each one with small Italian glass square. So you do have the odd impressive building, and of course that sits amongst the older, highly impressive municipal architecture, such as the City Hall and the Guildhall. So there are a lot of impressive buildings, but it does feel like a bit of a mess sometimes. I think the only area really that you would say is strikingly coherent is the Old Town, and I think that's what we'd really like to reflect on now.
Yeah, we've done the moaning. We're on to the praising now, the nice bit. I've been dying to talk about the Old Town. This is, as we've kind of been alluding to throughout the podcast, the old central heartland of Hull, and really has the kind of historic buildings and windy, narrow, old street pattern you would never expect to find here if you'd never been there. It's actually on effectively a man-made peninsula, which was created by the construction of the docks, and mostly surrounded by water. But it has 190 listed buildings from many eras, particularly from the eras ranging from Georgian up to Edwardian, and in a pretty small area of just 54 hectares. What's particularly interesting there are many highlights, but I'll pick a few out. Some of the artisan mannerist buildings. Artisan mannerism is a form of architecture carried out by masons from pattern books rather than by trained architects. So you don't get the same kind of classical commitment to proportions that you do in other buildings. So you get pretty unusual dimensions and scales there, which you either like or you don't, but it's different certainly. And if you think about the streetscape of the old town, it has this mixture of narrow medieval streets, wider Georgian streets, of course the horrible A63 which I mentioned earlier, but we won't dwell on that anymore. And there's also a lot of different paving types which give it a really constant variety. You've got stets, granites, stone paving and lots of others. So there is no feeling of uniformity anywhere in the old town. Another notable site in the old town is Trinity Square. This is the area around Hull Minster, which to my mind feels almost continental in the way you've got this central square area surrounded by relaxed open bars. It was expanded most recently in 2017 when the western churchyard wall of the Minster was removed, and they added, if you remember, Liam, those funny square pools of water in the ground, which I found out later are mirror pools. They're not fountains. They're supposed to kind of reflect their surroundings and create funny, unique shapes when you stir the water. So if we go back, we'll have to give them a stir.
Well, it was raining, so we couldn't really see reflections, but there you go.
No, that's true. The Minster itself, actually, is one of Hull's very few medieval buildings. The reason there aren't very many medieval buildings in Hull is because there's no natural stone building material in the area. So building anything that would last in the Middle Ages, before there was a regular supply of stone building material later on, was very, very expensive, prohibitively so. But you do have the Minster. It's at the heart of Trinity Square, and it also has the Peck window, which, when you look at it, it looks a bit of a mess of fragments, but it's actually supposed to be like that. It was put together that way. It comprises fragments of different coloured glass from windows smashed during raids, not in the Second World War, but in the First World War, during a Zeppelin raid in March 1916.
I thought that was an absolutely beautiful building. But adjacent to that as well was the covered market, which we thoroughly enjoyed. Some wonderful small streets, and we've put some pictures of these streets on Instagram.
And there's another window to talk about, of course. Apparently the country's smallest window in the George Hotel, which you can walk past and very easily miss. This is actually a very, very small window, which wasn't really used for that lighting. It was used as a lookout by the doorman back when the George was an old coaching inn. It does feel almost like you could count any old peephole as a window if they're going to do that, but Hull, they seem proud of it in Hull, so we'll let them have it. And the last thing I'll mention for the old town is the Queen's Gardens, which we walked through. 10-acre site near the Maritime Museum, because it was formerly part of the Queen's Dock and filled with water. It was drained later and turned into a public park.
And there's quite an impressive vista if you're sort of looking northeast along that dock towards the Hull College with the Wilberforce monument in front. Now, the Hull College might not be to everyone's taste, but it's certainly an impressive sight looking up that vista. And I think in the Abercrombie plan, the idea was to build on that axis of the city, but as we say, it didn't happen. But you're left with a quite charming Queen's Gardens. Unless
there's anything else, I think it's scores time.
There are areas of Hull that are beautiful, such as the Old Town that you've spoken about, Trinity Square. We've got the fantastic regeneration of the waterfront around the Deep. The Deep itself, it's a fantastic building designed by Terry Farrell, and it really is a landmark. And I think it's got a whole bunch of really impressive old municipal buildings. Queen Victoria Square, created in 1903, which contains the Ferrins Art Gallery, Maritime Museum and City Hall. Really good collections of buildings, as well as the Old Town. So I think there's a lot to see. But you really have to balance that with, some of the parts of the city which just are terrible to walk around, roads that are difficult to cross. Ferrins Way is a real disappointment. So there's a lot here that I really, really like. It's an unpolished gem in many ways, let's say. So I'll be giving it a 5.
Hull has a reputation, let's be honest about it, as a dump. That's what most people would say about Hull. I'm sorry, but it's true. If you ask most people, it's one of those places where people would say that. But actually, it's a city of contrasts, and it's just all the more interesting for it. And there are some parts probably as run down, some parts as ugly as you'll find anywhere else in the country. And even in the centre, parts that you mentioned, particularly bits of the old shopping area on White Friargate, were pretty hideous. But the further in areas of the old town, a lovely contrast to this. There's a real mixture of streetscapes, a mixture of buildings that really reflects the variety of Hull's history and is celebrated brilliantly. And I think what this does is makes Hull so much more interesting than so many other towns. Your classic bland home counties commuter town that rings London has nothing on this. So there are prettier places out there, there are better designed places out there, there are cleaner places out there, but I don't think there are all that many more interesting places. So I'm going to give it a pretty good score. I'm going to give it a 6.5.
So our final category is called reality versus expectations, and this enables us to level things up between cities. So some places have great reputations and, they often deserve it. We went to Bath and it was absolutely as beautiful as it's known to be. But this category enables us to give some scores where a place has exceeded expectations. And look, we regularly see Hull, as you said in the last category, Daniel, we regularly see Hull near the top of lists of Britain's worst places. I think these lists are pretty daft, but there is a reputation that Hull's not the prettiest place. And, maybe that's inevitable because of the impact of the Blitz, low-quality post-war urban regeneration, and general industrial decline that's left a mark on the urban environment. But my take is that actually, despite its reputation, there's a hell of a lot to do in Hull. Areas of it that are really quite beautiful. But look, I'm going to give Hull a good score in this category because of that reputation. And yet, when you visit, you've got a museums quarter, which has got a handful of museums that we've mentioned that are really excellent. You've got the Queen Victoria Square area with the again a collection of art gallery, museums, pleasant buildings. You've got the Old Town, which is another centre worth visiting. You've got the area around the Minster, Trinity Square, and you've got the buildings of the waterfront. But different areas of interest in the city, none of which are particularly vast each, but collectively it makes an interesting day out. I'm going to give it an 8.
It's definitely a good score for me too. Let's be honest, reality versus expectations is basically designed as a category for places like Hull. I've already kind of, in my summing up for urban landscape, given an overview of what I think the general reputation of Hull is, and it is deserved to some extent in some areas, but it is just such an interesting place to go to. I've probably been to Hull about half a dozen times, maybe more. It's not an easy place to get to. For me, it's going to be a 7.5. Okay, so going through the final scores for politics and war, 9 out of 20. Science and industry, an impressive 15 out of 20. Art and culture, 8.5 out of 20. Urban landscape, 11.5 out of 20. Reality versus expectations, 15.5 out of 20. Some pretty strong scores there. So overall, Hull has got 59.5 out of 100.
And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. And I'm sure you'd agree, Daniel, we could have spoken for a lot longer on many aspects of Hull's history. Just recommending that people take a visit. As ever, please leave any comments on our website, yeoldeguide.com. Please, if you can, we'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and review at Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. And I always ask this question, and we don't know the answer. Where are we off to next? That's
to be discussed. We still have Warrington in the pipeline. We still have a couple of other towns we've visited that we're going to bring out, but we'll put a tweet out once we know where we're going next.
I think the new capital of culture will be worth a visit.
Bradford, of course. we'll definitely be going there again at some point.
Excellent. So, well, that's all from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you and goodbye.